Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of In Lay Terms. I'm very pleased today because I have here with me Mr. Peter MacIsaac from Nova Scotia. Welcome, Peter.
Thanks for having me, Payman. I appreciate the invite.
No. I'm glad you agreed to come on and on short notice. We had a phone call earlier and you ran circles around me, and I just knew you'd be a great guest to have on.
Well, I try to entertain and teach at the same time.
All right. Then it's going to be a great episode. Peter, let's get things started. You, from our conversation, you strike me as a kind of guy that's had actual experience in politics. Can you give us just a quick recap of how you got to where you are?
Okay, so background on me, I grew up in a rural community in Cape Breton, and my dad was in the military, and my first 11 years I spent on military bases. Actually, I spent 5 years in Germany playing in bomb craters after World War II. And I had a very early education on problems with socialism and some of the problems we're starting to see here in Canada. And I went off into private industry, and from there I became a provincial game warden, and I had a 29-year career doing law enforcement. I was a wildlife specialist and a professional forest firefighter. And before I retired, I started a film production company, and I did a hunt fish television series that I hosted coast to coast Canada and around the world. It was the first father-daughter hunt fish series of its type. And I got a shoulder injury related to work. And after that, I had to shut down the series. And I said, okay, what am I going to do next? Well, the guy was running for the premier in Nova Scotia, and some people had asked me to run for politics provincially. And I was involved in marketing and a bunch of other things. And I said, well, I really don't want to do it. But the reality is when I was inside government, I had seen so much corruption and complete and total lack of meritocracy, people in positions they should never be in. I had always hoped that one day maybe I'd be able to fix things. And so when the opportunity to came up to run for an MLA here in Nova Scotia, I took it. And I had no experience up to that point in politics. I didn't win, but I had probably the best showing they had in that riding for the Conservatives in the previous 30 years. And so I stayed involved in provincial politics. And then from there, I moved up into federal politics and became the president of an electoral district association in Halifax West. And I took that from a very small, they couldn't form a quorum, to over 30 people. And we were highly successful. And then some corruption popped up inside the federal Conservative Party, dealing with our EDA. I wrote up, with my law enforcement background, I wrote up a formal complaint, passed it up to Andrew Scheer, who did nothing. And I said, well, okay, this is a simple fix. What's going on here? And I was ruffling some feathers at national, and people weren't happy with what I was doing. And so when Andrew Scheer left the federal Conservative Party, the next guy that came in, I don't remember what his name was now. He wasn't around long. I passed the same file on to him. He did nothing. And well, I shouldn't say he did nothing. They arranged to have me removed as president of the EDA, and they suspended me from the party. And eventually, I was out of the party. So at that point, I was 100% confident that the political system, from what I'd seen provincially and federally, is completely and totally broken from the inside. And, never wanted to give up based on the training and things I'd seen over my life. When you're a professional hunter, I was a big game guide and a bunch of other things. You learn patience, and you learn that, no matter what's happening, if you've got your eye on the prize, you can eventually make changes. So what ended up happening was I had a meeting with two highly respected engineers here in the province of Nova Scotia, and they said, the system's broken. How are we going to fix this? And they're in the same boat that I'm in. They've got kids, grandkids, and I'm 66 and the father. I've got 5 kids and 6 grandkids. And so what we had decided was there has to be a way to give the power in politics and put it back into the hands of the people. And those two guys as engineers specialize in breaking things and then putting them back together better. That's their specialty as engineers. So what they'll do is, they'll look at something and take it apart and they'll vastly improve it. So they came up with the idea of running enough independent candidates in the province of Nova Scotia that in the event of what just happened in BC, where you have a really close election between the major parties, it's the small groups. Like in BC right now, you guys have 2 Green Party members that are going to control what happens in politics inside of BC for the next 4 years. So based on that strategy, we knew that could work, before it happened in BC. So we have 1.1 million people in Nova Scotia, and 45% of us didn't show up to vote in the last election. And so what we had decided we were going to do was try to run 55 independents. We have 55 ridings in Nova Scotia. I mean, imagine 55 ridings for only 1.1 million people. I mean, down in New York, they have one person looking after more people than that, right? So anyways, we're burdened with an extremely complex bureaucracy in Nova Scotia. And the current Premier, Tim Houston, he had a minority government with 34 seats, but 7 of those seats he only won by a couple of hundred votes. So we knew at the time that if we ran independent candidates in those areas, there was a high probability we could unseat the Premier, bring things back to an even tie or a close tie between the other parties. And if we could get elected 8, 10, maybe 12 independents, those independents would control the balance of power for the next 4 years. And we could start unwinding all the damage that was created by the previous party and the Liberal Party and the Conservative Party that's in power now. Because what most people don't understand is, irregardless of how good your intentions are when you go into politics, and irregardless of what promises you make, the day you're elected, you're brought into a meeting, and basically you're given you're given the lecture that you're to sit down, shut up, and do exactly what you're told. And regardless of the promises that you made to the people who voted you in, they all go in the trash can same day. And you're told that, look, you're allowed to lie to them, tell them you're working on things, even if you're not. Because day one, the next goal is, how do we get elected and stay in power next term? So that's what we launched here last summer. And the Nova Scotia government, when the current Premier got in, the very first piece of legislation that he passed was fixed election dates. And our fixed election date was for July 2025. And yesterday, he broke his word to everybody in Nova Scotia and called a snap election. And so the question has to be asked, why would a Premier, 3 years into a 4-year term with a 7-seat majority, why would he call an election and run the risk of being unseated? So your listeners need to know that in New Brunswick, they went to an election up there just a couple of weeks ago too, maybe even only last week. And all the polls had them neck and neck between the Liberals and Conservatives. And when they went to the polls, the Liberals somehow with electronic voting, or the Conservatives somehow with electronic voting, got crushed. And the new Premier that came in, one of her primary goals right off the hop is to bring in a digital ID in the province of New Brunswick. And digital ID opens the door to full government control of your life. The next step is central bank digital currency. And if we allow that to happen, your freedom's gone. So what we did here in the province, we have to ask the question, why did our Premier call a snap election? Because the answer that he's given is nonsensical. It doesn't make sense. So we were in the process with the Independent Nova Scotia Initiative. And to be clear, we're not a party. All we are is a training organization. And we've been traveling coast to coast, from one end of Nova Scotia to the other, talking to communities and town halls and homes about the advantages of running independents in upcoming provincial elections. And so everywhere we went, we had tremendous response. We just had 100% of the people, when they understood what we were trying to do, they ended up, they went from being highly skeptical to being highly supportive. So we had a plan in place that if the election had been called as legally guaranteed through legislation, we'd had our 55 candidates in place for the next election. And the Premier also knew that we were hot on his heels. So like I said, he broke his own law. And then the other thing I have to look at, we have major problems inside elections in Nova Scotia. We had a by-election here the end of April, and we had an independent candidate, a gentleman named Bobby Lee Dillman, a local guy. And for 6 days in a row, he tried to get his papers filed so he could run as an independent. And we have affidavits, emails, written correspondence, and eyewitness evidence that proves that the commissioner in charge of elections Nova Scotia and the chief financial officer both conspired over a 6-day period to make sure that man's papers weren't accepted, so he couldn't get his name on the ballot. And if you're an independent, it's critical to get your name on a ballot. So he was pretty upset, didn't get his name on a ballot. But fortunately for us, the government showed their hand. They were telling him that he had certain requirements that he had to meet. And it turned out it wasn't the case at all. He was misled for 6 days and he got screwed over hard. So anyways, he's a bit of a scrapper. And we managed to get a high profile a legal firm in Halifax to write a letter to Elections Nova Scotia. And we wanted to know, okay, we need a clear definition of what you guys are doing. So they wrote back, they wrote back you could tell there was plenty of legalese in it, but the lawyers got involved and they sent a letter back to the legal firm. And basically they admitted, yes, we screwed up in a big way. He should have been on the ballot. And so they tried to make amends to him. And the amends were, they said, what can we do to make this up to you? Well, what we wanted to do was we wanted to nullify the by-election, run a new election that he'd be able to run in and do what he wanted to legally. And in order to have that's another thing, by calling this election, that nullified the potentiality of that happening. So that particular person 2 Fridays ago filed a formal criminal complaint with the head of the province's Justice Department. And a letter went through to our Minister of Justice. And the Minister of Justice, now that the province has shut down the legislature, she doesn't have to force anything. So everything's been stalled. And if he wins the election, they go back in, this thing's all getting buried. And when they asked him one of the conditions, how could they make this right? Because he had been grieved. He said, well, what's going to have to happen is the commissioner for Elections Nova Scotia is going to have to step down or be fired. And the CFO is going to have to be fired. And the CFO snapped, jumped in front of the camera, much like we are here, started screaming into the thing, and the lawyer cut the feed. And that was on Thursday, just gone by. And the premier was going to call an election Friday. He didn't. And Saturday he didn't, but he did call it yesterday. And like I said, that was his very first piece of legislation. His word now to the electorate in Nova Scotia means absolutely nothing. He's now a confirmed, right, like a 100% by legislation confirmed liar. His word means nothing. It doesn't even mean, and he's saying, well, we're going to want to give you guys a 1% HST cut if I get elected next year. Not now, not before the election. But I'm the guy who lied to you about a set election date. And I think you should trust me and believe me, even though I'm a confirmed liar. And if you vote me in, I'll give you a 1% HST cut. So that's kind of what we're dealing down here with right now. So we're hoping that we'll have at least 20 candidates registered here within the next few days. We won't have everything that we wanted. But our goal is if we can get enough independents elected, we can control the balance of power. Now, one of the guys out in your neck of the woods I had a chance to speak to was Brian Peckford. And Brian believes 100% in what we're doing with independents because, like us, he's 100% convinced the party system is broken and can't be repaired. You categorically cannot count on politicians to do anything they tell you they're going to do because of a court decision in the 90s that's called the Little Child case. And that Little Child case was a case where local people went after somebody they had elected. They made promises, they lied, they broke their word. And so what ended up happening is they tried to sue them and say, look, we want to hold you responsible. And in that court case, a Canadian judge ruled that no politician in Canada is responsible to their voters after the day they're elected. They don't have to return your phone calls, emails. They don't even have to talk to you because if you get to talk, you get to judge them 4 years later. So Brian Peckford come up with a brilliant idea. I got to give credit where credit's due. He said, Pete, the issue that you're going to have with independence is their independent thinking. and they're going to be hard to, it's kind of like herding cats. It's not an easy thing to do. So he suggested that we put together a contract. So independents that are going to run down here in Nova Scotia, we've asked them to sign a performance contract with the community that they're going to run in, where they will guarantee in a contract that whatever planks the community wants them to bring to the legislature, they'll do it. They'll do it in a specified time frame. They agree not to cross the floor, lie, cheat, steal, any of those things. It'd be like any basic contract when you get hired on a job. And so what they're going to do is they sign that contract and they get elected, and then they fail to live up to any of the conditions of the contract. You can sue them for breach of contract, and one of the terms in the contract is they have to resign from politics. So technically, for the first time in Canada, legally, you're going to be able to fire a useless politician if that's what they turn out to be. So people who didn't show up to vote, like the 45% here in Nova Scotia who didn't vote in the last election, that's who we're targeting. Look, they're saying, why would I vote for the Liberals, the NDP, or the Conservatives? They're going to do what they want when they get in. Well, they do that because of that legal case where they know they have indemnity to do exactly what they want. They don't have to do anything they promised you to do. They can lie, and that's what they do. And you'll find that the best politicians are psychopathic liars, because they can look at you and smile and you can't tell whether they're lying to you or not. So what we found in the communities that we went to is the bulk of the people that are going to run are people that didn't want to run. And they had to be convinced to do it because it's the right thing to do. And what people need to understand, what an independent can do. One or two independents can't do much, because people say, well, what's a couple independents going to do? And the answer is not much. But if you get enough of them and things and the numbers work, you can completely take control of government. And here's what you can do. They can go in and table legislation without party approval. See, most people don't understand. Let's say I'm in your community and I promise you guys the moon, right? You're getting a new highway coming through town and we'll put money in all these different projects. And then I get in and go, well, now that we've looked at the books, we don't have the money and we can't do any of this stuff, right? So what happens is you're looking at these people who continually lie, and for, like I said, for the first time in Canadian history, you're going to be able to fire them. And the nice thing is rather than be selected, so most people don't understand about this politics either. How do people end up running for most cases in politics? The parties go after them, and they go after people that can be controlled, bribed, or blackmailed, right? And people are going to say, well, it's not that bad. Well, I'm telling you that is that bad, because what will happen is once you get in politics, they will use that as a lever to get you to do what you want to do. And the other lever that they'll use against you is if you don't take orders well, they'll do what Tim Houston did down here to Elizabeth Smith McCrossin during COVID. She went out and stood on the border between Nova Scotia and New Brunswick with her constituents who wanted her there. And the province was disallowing people living in New Brunswick traveling back and forth. It was a real headache. So she went up and did what her constituents asked her to do, and the premier didn't like it, and he kicked her out of caucus. So now she's an independent. And when she ran as an independent in the last election, she got 68 or 62 or 68% of the vote, and she'll win in this upcoming riding again. So anyways, the nice thing about what we're doing with independents, it's up to the community to talk a person into doing it. Because the first person that says, pick me, in most cases is someone who's never, they'll be making more money than they ever made. You got to remember, for example, a federal MP now makes $200,000 a year. Provincially down here, an MLA makes around $90,000, and you get staff and you get a bunch of perks. But for the average, the average guy who's making $60,000, if he makes 90 and he's doing a, 1/10 of the work he used to do, it's a gravy train. And when we had the previous Liberal premier that we had in, they changed the rules. I think it's after 2 years now, you qualify for a pension. So for the first 2 years, they hold that sword over your head. Sit down, shut up, do what you're told. And if you make it to the 2-year mark without us throwing you under the bus, you're going to get a pension. So everybody goes, that sounds like a sweet deal. So they shut up and they don't do. And everybody, it's almost like they, when you go into the legislature, most people park their backbone at the door. and someone that you thought was a scrapper, he just turns out to be a wet fish. And so, and the reason being, you say, well, what happened to him? What happened to him was the guarantee of a pension and 90 grand. And we'll put you on as a minister. I mean, if we really need to up the ante, we'll put you on different committees, and maybe you'll be making 150 grand a year. And for 150 grand a year, a lot of people will sell their soul. They'll put up with all kinds of things, knowing if I can get through my first 2 years, I got maybe a pension that I didn't used to have. After 4 years, it's an increased pension. If I get in a little bit longer, I think it's 6 years, you get like a maximum pension. And so what happens is you find some people, I'm trying to word this and not be as hard on people as I should be, is that most people get in politics for the wrong reason. They get in to ingratiate themselves and line their own pockets. With the independent movement, it's up to the community to find someone whose handshake still means something, who doesn't have a history of lying, cheating, stealing, right? Who, when they tell you they're going to do something, they actually do it, right? And those are the type of people that we're finding in the communities that they had to go through and talk into running. And so all of a sudden, those are the guys who say, sure, I'll sign any contract you want, right? If I don't do the job, fire me. I'm good with that. No political party in Canada will allow any of their members to sign a contract like that. They're just not going to allow it, because the party owns you. The second that you sign up, the party owns you. And the only way to do anything, but you have to cross the floor. And sometimes you'll see people do it. But normally you only see people crossing the floor who already have their pension in place.
Can I let me jump in here. Just to break it down for the audience, when we say that the party owns the candidates,
Yeah.
like why are we not seeing more candidates come in, and then once they get, they use the party to get elected, why don't they just say, screw it, kick me out if you want, but I love my country and I'd rather go independent?
It's the same reason that 90% of Canadians went and got the jab, right? Is because first of all, it's crowd mentality. There are very few true warriors amongst us. There's a lot more than people realize. I'd say 1 in 10. But the reality of it is most people are not willing to push back when pushed. And so very few people, I'll give you an example. A lot of the skill set that's required to be really good in politics, if you're really good, you're off running a business, doing something on your own. And then you still have your life. Because as a politician, you got to remember, you got to, whether you like people or not, once you make a promise, your word's your word, and promise is a promise, and a deal's a deal. So you've got to live up to it. And so the other thing we're hearing from independents is, we've had people down here said, if we get enough of us, we'll table legislation so that you can only run one 4-year term. You can't run 2 terms. So if your goal in politics is to get a long-term pension and take in as much money, more money than you've ever made, for example, what ends up happening is you no matter how well intended you are, it takes a lot of courage to stand up to a crowd, and they just flat won't do it. And I've seen people that I had high hopes for on an ongoing basis, and once they're in that system for a little while, it's like they just jumped into a wood chipper or a meat grinder, and what comes out the other end isn't what went in the first place. And so that's what politics does to people, and that's why people don't want to get involved. And the other thing is right now, I would think there'd be more criminals wanting to get involved, to be honest with you, because nobody's being held accountable on any party. It doesn't matter what they do. People aren't being held accountable. You know how many people? Even today, what got named? 4 people that were potentially named today for being involved in election interference. Well, CSIS went to our federal government and told them, quite some time ago that they have at least 11 people in Parliament. We have a mayor down here that just won an election here in Halifax, and he was one of the first rats to jump a sinking ship. And as soon as that the information came out from CSIS that 11 people were potentially compromised inside Parliament, he resigned from the Liberal Party and came down here and ran for the mayor, and he just won. And then we find out this week that elections, the people that ran the election said that thousands of electronic votes didn't get counted in this election because of some form of irregularities, right? And so down here, a lot of governments just switched to electronic voting. In this election, Elections Nova Scotia just brought in a whole new system of electronic voting, and it's tied back to the same companies that had problems with electronic voting in the United States. And the same companies that were involved with that mess you guys are experiencing out in BC right now. I mean, did I hear correctly that like 45 or 50,000 new ballots just showed up in BC after 8 or 9 days?
It's hard to tell. I heard the number 61,000, but
61,000.
I don't know how the election system is supposed to work. Like, I don't know if these are usually hidden from the public until they come in. But 61,000 seems like a lot of ballots.
The only things that's supposed to happen in an election, and the only way for elections to work, is you have to have paper ballots, and you have to have mountains of scrutineers. And in all elections, up until electronic voting started, you went in on election day, you voted, and everybody knew who the winner was by midnight that night. They had people that were, there were volunteers and people that were approved to go in and count the ballots, and then you had people standing over their shoulders to make sure they weren't cheating, because irregardless of what you have that's electronic, there's a 100% guarantee that it can or will be hacked. I don't care who it is. You can talk to anybody that's an IT expert. Every system has back doors built into it. Someone will eventually figure out the back doors, and they'll be hacked. I'll give you an example. Down in Nova Scotia last week, one of the really egregious things that the premier did, he cut a deal with Ottawa to make sure that everybody's data, health data, became accessible to anybody that the premier deems can look at that data. And they don't have to be a doctor. They don't have to be a politician. If the premier wants to look at your private health data, he can do it, right? So what ends up happening is there's just so much corruption. There's so much laws don't apply. And, I look at what these guys did with that election data. And then we have our auditor general just come out and said, all that data now is at risk. Same as, and they haven't come out and said that yet with the election, but the auditor general just said, what's near and dear to the hearts of all Nova Scotians is their own private medical information. Okay. That's Tim Houston took that. Everybody's private data, forced the doctors to turn it all in. It all went into a data bank. The information I got was that data bank was already sent to Ottawa as part of a deal that Tim Houston did to take in hundreds of millions of extra dollars from the feds, and that data now is at risk of being hacked and stolen. So someone's got a big problem trying to convince me if our cherished super private medical data, if our auditor general is concerned that can be hacked, how can they not be concerned at the same time that our election's not going to be hacked?
Can I put this in context?
Yeah, go ahead.
We have people that want liberty. We have globalist elites, leaders that do not want to give up their control on any of these provinces. There is a lot of evidence of election fraud in BC. I'm guessing in New Brunswick as well, and it's probably going to be there in Saskatchewan and Nova Scotia. And these people are deathly afraid of like any independent movement getting in. Is that accurate?
Down in Nova Scotia, I can definitively tell you the last thing they want is independents controlling the legislature. So they've put roadblocks in place. For example, an independent can't form a local EDA, Electoral District Association, until the writ gets dropped. So, for example, if you're with the Conservative Party, you have an EDA 4 years from one election to the next election. You can raise money, fill your coffers, you can have board meetings, you can be organized, you can have everything ready for a campaign. They set the system up so that independents can't form an EDA or take any donations and issue receipts until the writ is actually dropped. So the writ was dropped Sunday, and we'll be going to an election, I think, in 30 or 30 some days. And so right off the bat, they're at a major disadvantage to anybody else. And then the other issue is, as an independent, Um, okay, there's that. There's a number of other things that you
You
can't.
can't issue tax receipts, right?
Yeah, you can't issue tax receipts until the writ is actually dropped. But if you're going to run an adequate campaign, you need the money in advance to be able to get your signage, your office, everything else that you need to have set up. So basically, the province has figured out the last thing we need is more independence. So let's throw every roadblock in their path that we possibly can. As a matter of fact, even when you're elected, you don't automatically have access to all the research, the government research, like the staff that they have will go, if you're an MLA, you can ask and they'll do research for you, and government libraries and databases. As an independent, you don't automatically have access to those things. So what we heard from one end of the province to the other is that there's a number of things that people in Nova Scotia want changed in legislation that's for the betterment of everybody. For example, SOGI down here in the schools is just an absolute disaster, and our premier embraces it. The other thing our premier has done is he has wholeheartedly now he's promoting diversity, equity, and inclusion as government policy for all hiring down here. So, I look at some of these things, and if you don't have enough independence and they have a majority, they'll ram stuff like that through, and there's nothing you can do about it. But as independents, we can pass independents can pass or table legislation, and if they control the majority, right? If they've got the balance of votes where they can, for example, they can force an election. You can force sitting parties to do almost anything that you want, because once they're in power, they're willing to negotiate in any way, shape, or form to stay in power. So you can basically, it's kind of like what the NDP's done with Justin Trudeau. They get what they want, and he gets to stay in power, and that's what enough independence can do. So you can table that legislation. You can table recall. We can clean up a bunch of stuff that's happening in our school systems. That DEI hiring policy, that's just how societies collapse. You start hiring people that aren't qualified to do a job based on skin color, race, sexual orientation, or sex, for example, because you're a woman or a man or a house cat today or whatever you want to claim yourself to be. I mean, you're laughing, but I'm going to tell you in Nova Scotia, the actual hiring policy is if let's say you went in and there's 5 men, 5 women, you're all highly talented, everybody's equal. Okay, so in Nova Scotia, right off the bat, the women get preference in hiring policy. And if one of those girls says they're gay, she gets the preference. And if another one says I'm gay but in transition, then she gets the preference. And the more boxes you tick determines who gets the job, not who's the best person to do the job. So I've seen it in police forces across Canada. I've seen it in our healthcare system. I've seen it in corporate boardrooms. And I see it at every level in provincial and federal and municipal government. When people get hired to do jobs and they're not the most qualified, everything around them turns to crap, everything. And here's what happens. When you're unqualified to do a job, very few of those people have the leadership skills required to hire more intelligent people than themselves, that's a true measure of leadership. Surround yourself with people smarter than you if you can, right? But if you're a DEI hire, your tendency is to hire people dumber than you so that you continue to look good and they don't show you up. And the issue being is the way the system is set up now, those people can't be fired. It's virtually almost impossible to fire a DEI hire because they claim prejudice and they'll sue the government or they'll sue a board member or they'll sue anything. So DEI, and same thing with ESG, that's being forced on corporations. It's just absolutely disastrous. And our premier brought it in, and I watched leadership meetings where the leader of the Liberal Party, Conservative Party, and the NDP are arguing who's doing a better job of hiring more DEI hires. I mean, these people don't realize how absolutely insane that sounds. I mean, I've owned different businesses. I mean, I'd fire you. Even talking that way, I just fire you. You're gone. I mean, I look at it as being a mind disease. You need to be out of here. So wokeism has invaded everything across the country. And all you have to do is look at some of the policies that we have inside the federal government. It's insane. So anyway.
I have another general question for the audience. We're talking about the political parties. So their main drive, their main goal is to stay in power, to get reelected. But
Always.
but the people don't want these DEI policies. But the government and the parties, they keep pushing these DEI policies. So what is the party? Is it like a billionaire class of donors? Or is it the board?
What ends up happening, who controls the parties? It's always the backroom boys. Whoever you see up front, they're not making decisions. Even our premier. Uh, I actually helped him get elected. And I apologize to everybody in Nova Scotia for doing that, right? But he lied to me the same as he lied to everybody else. And it turns out he's a Manchurian candidate. He came from something called the Paradise Papers. Our premier is he's an accountant, and for 10 years he was down in the Caribbean, and the company that he did business with, it wasn't illegal, but they walked a razor's edge, and his job was to make sure that you paid as little taxes as humanly possible, which I agree with. But he made a full-time living doing that. When he came back up to Nova Scotia as an accountant, he was worth over $10 million. And he's a Mason, right? He's part of the secret handshake club. And here in Nova Scotia, we've got at least 5,500 Masons, and they're embedded across all levels of government, all of them. And so, I watch people get hired and go, why did you get hired? And then I find out 3 or 4 people sitting on the hiring panel were brother Masons. And, or they were in the box ticking club. Well, why? How did that person possibly get this job and get put into that position of management? Well, they're in transition. He came in here wearing a dress last week. Man, there's nothing we can do. We got to hire him or he's going to sue us. I'm really glad that I retired back in, I guess it was 2012 when I retired. I mean, I don't know how I'd function. Even when I was inside government, the amount of corruption and the money being wasted and the decisions being made, it was actually staggering. In my entire career, I never saw one person in management outright fired. Not one. I saw them laterally transferred. I saw them promoted. Saw them given a job where they didn't have to deal with people anymore, but I never saw them fired. And now it's even worse because, like I said, what happens once you start doing DEI hires, and they started a lot of it here in Canada in the 90s, actually it really started inside the RCMP. And what happened is that poured over through court decisions and one decision after another. And like I said, what happens is once you get a DEI hire, it's like putting ink in a well, and they will, if given an opportunity to hire people, they'll surround themselves with people that are highly incompetent. The amount of mass gross incompetence at all levels of government in Nova Scotia and federally from coast to coast is actually staggering. I mean, I'm looking at the Liberal Party right now, looking to bring in Mark Carney. And I mean, every circus needs a Carney, right? And so you've got Mark up there. He just got put on the board of Stripe. Stripe is one of the companies that handles most of the major credit card transactions at some of the biggest players in the world. And I think last year they paid out something like $182 million in bonuses. And he just got put on the board. And now he's a top advisor for the Liberals. And if Trudeau gets put out, people need to be worried about what they wish for, because it'd be Mark Carney trying to step in. It was going to be Chrystia Freeland, but she turned out to be too dumb, so they and making too many mistakes, and you can't sell her, right? It's like she's like trying to sell like a week-old bread, right? Way past its best before date, and she's an international embarrassment. But Mark Carney isn't. Mark Carney's a highly intelligent, extremely smart businessman, and he's dangerous beyond dangerous. And he's WEF. I believe he might even be on their board of directors. He's 100% behind the climate agenda. And he comes, I believe at one time he was in charge of the Bank of Canada. Very, very, very dangerous man to be in politics. Extremely catastrophic should that man end up leading the Liberal Party.
Let's transition to climate change. What's your view on this climate change agenda, and then tie it into the forest fires?
Okay, so here's what everybody needs to understand. Government's own data. We have 318 billion trees in Canada. We have the third largest forests in the world, coast to coast. We've got all kinds of big, vast areas that are treed and hardly anybody's on there. So 318 billion trees. Stats Canada says that each tree absorbs 48 pounds of CO2 annually. So that's over 15 trillion pounds of CO2 our forests suck up every year. Now, that's not counting our grasslands or lakes or agricultural land. That's just strictly trees suck up over 15 trillion pounds of CO2 annually. Okay. From all causes in Canada, everything that we do, every industry, every vehicle, everything that we do, we produce 1.13 trillion pounds of CO2. And the trees suck up 15 trillion. So we only need 9% of our forest to suck up all the CO2. Canada is a massive CO2 sink. Now, if I believed in any of this stuff, the Canadian government should be selling carbon credits to other countries. We'd be debt free, right? But the reality of it is we could crank up our CO2 output by a factor of 10 and still not affect the world negatively with our CO2. And so out of that, okay, so I'll give you an example. So we have 1.14 trillion. So right now, Canada, I believe, I'm just pulling this out of my head, I believe that we produce 1.3% of the world's CO2, right? I believe that's what we produce is 1.1, 1.3 or 1.4%. Ultimately, what happens is the amount of CO2 that we're reducing in the atmosphere, it comes down to, I think it's 4 zeros and then 18, like 0.00018% of the world's CO2 that's going in the atmosphere is put in by Canada. And we're a carbon sink. And so when people drive this, this carbon tax nonsense and try to jam it down our throats, they try to say, well, we have to do something. Well, China's not doing anything. The US doesn't have a carbon tax and their carbon emissions dropped. And the government's saying that ours are going up. Well, it doesn't matter. They can go up 900%. It's not going to make any difference because their trees suck up all the CO2. So it's absolute nonsense. But here's the thing. They can't tax. They have to find a way to be able to tax you to support their agendas. And the Liberal agenda now, everything that they hung their hat on in the last election revolved around the climate scare and the climate agenda. And if it turns out that science says, well, we made a big mistake here, and Canada actually is, by your own number, a carbon sink, and you're taxing companies into oblivion, and it's not affecting anything at all. It's so minuscule that it's insane. So I'll give you an example. Last year in Nova Scotia, we had the largest forest fire in our history. And right off the bat, the federal government jumped on the facts, climate change. Well, it wasn't. It turned out to be arson. And people need to understand that arson's not climate change. Arson's arson. That's criminal activity. So the question is who lit the fire? Well, the RCMP went down, did an investigation, said, well, we can't prove who did it. And so because they're a federal agency, they didn't want to make their bosses look bad. So they just said, well, indeterminate. So DNR went down, Department of Natural Resources, and I think within 3 days, they were in the process of laying charges for arson. And I looked at the aerial photography when the fire started, and immediately I went, whoa, there's a number of ignition points. This looks like someone driving down a trail with an ATV setting multiple fires. Looked like arson to me. But I wasn't on the ground. But ultimately, it was determined to be arson. And so we ran into an issue down in Nova Scotia. My wife and I had our stuff packed. We were in a danger zone, and we were going to have to leave the area. And I said, well, this is nonsense. I'm a professional forest firefighter. Why don't I put together a team of some of the guys I know who retired, and we'll go into overhead positions and help out. The province is crying for people. And I put together a team, and I called the Premier's office, and I called the Minister of Natural Resources offices, and I called fire control in central Nova Scotia. And I said, look, I got a team of guys. I know that you guys are crying for people. We can be on the job within 4 hours anywhere you want in the province. And I made that call for 4 days in a row. And 4 days in a row, the province said, no, we don't want you and we don't need you. And
let me pick up on that. Why do you think the province takes that position? Because this happened in Nova Scotia, it happened in BC, it happened in Hawaii, it happened with the hurricane. It's happening everywhere. Hurricane in the U.S.
Okay, so when a sitting government hung their hat on climate change, in order to prove climate change, right? You have to have evidence. And so what's the evidence that the government continually stands up in the legislature and says proof of climate change? We've got storms, and we've got out of control forest fires all over Canada. Well, they don't tell you that sometimes as high as 60% of those fires are arson fires. And little arson fires don't support the agenda. You have to have big fires. You have to have big fires that make national news. I'll give you an example. While those two fires were burning in Nova Scotia, I was contacted by somebody in Quebec that said, man, take a look at this video that someone just captured on a satellite. And it showed 13 fires starting almost simultaneously. And I think they were as far as 1,000 kilometers apart. It was a wide range. So I looked at it all, and then I checked into the weather data, and there hadn't been lightning storms. And I took a look at it, and they said, first blush, Pete, what do you think happened? Because I was also a certified fire initiation specialist. I forget what the term was they called us, but I was one of the guys we sent in to determine, how a fire gets started. And I just looked at the video, and I looked at it, and I said, well, this looks like a highly coordinated arson. And I said, I don't know, could have been done with drones, could have been done with military equipment, but I said, none of this looks like normal forest fires. I've never seen anything like this. All at the same time, 1,000 kilometers apart, no lightning strikes within the last 12 to 24 hours. I said, something's not adding up here. Well, what was adding up was the federal government was hitting us 3 weeks later with a major carbon tax increase. And at the time, down in the United States, down in New York, they were having a massive meeting on what to do over climate change. And it just so happened that on the clear sunny day when all these fires started, that smoke blew down in New York, and it was down in there for 7 days during this big climate change thing. And so here's what happens is, because I was an investigator for 29 years, all I look at is evidence. And then I look at what could be circumstantial. And then what you do is with circumstantial evidence, then you start to put together what the courts refer to as a preponderance of evidence. What's this all adding up to? You've got pieces of a puzzle, and what's it all pointing to? And what it's pointing to in Canada for the bulk of the really big fires, right, that are arson created, that turn into really big fires, the question is who benefits most from really big forest fires in Canada now?
I guess the question I'm trying to get at is good people, you, me, the audience, we have a really hard time. We assume other politicians are like us. How much of this do you think is evil? Like, do you think they're actually paying people to start fires?
Okay, so back in 1974, the RCMP, Pierre Trudeau, Justin Trudeau's dad, was in power when the FLQ crisis came along. And a police officer detonated a bomb in Quebec on Canadian soil, and Pierre Trudeau used that to justify cracking down on people's civil liberties with the FLQ crisis. That ended up in court. Ultimately, that court case was thrown out. I've worked with different police agencies for 29 years. I worked inside government. I will tell your audience this: the government lies to you every single day. And what most people find that hard, because my dad never believed that till the day he died. He was a military guy. He used to say to me, don't talk so damn foolish, man. He said, they're not going to lie to us about big stuff like that. And I just went, well, Dad, I was on that case today. I was actually there. And what the news just told you that came from us is 180 degrees opposite to what just happened. Well, he said, what do you mean? I said, well, I was there, and that's categorically not the truth. I was there, and I saw it with my own two eyes. So we used to lie to the public every day about different issues. And the biggest way the government lies to you is by omission. 10% of what they tell you is outright lies, and 90% is by omission, where they only tell you what makes them look good. Because if you knew the other 90% of what actually happened, you would be at their door with torches and pitchforks. So the government habitually keeps information from us, and they say, well, we're not really lying. We're just not telling you the whole story. Well, that's lying, right? So that's how the government lies to you, and they do it every day. Every single day of my career, in one form or another, the government lied to the population here in Nova Scotia every day. So when people go, well, geez, they can't all be bad, and they're not all bad. There's a lot of people out there, to be honest with you. People today are so busy just trying to keep a roof over their head, gas in their car, and food in their kids' face, and trying not to lose their house because of interest rates. They don't have time to pay attention. They don't have time to do research. I lost a boy when he was 18 to cancer back in 2001, and I became a really in-depth, avid researcher. And I started realizing, okay, Big Pharma seems to be hiding some stuff here. Why is this not common knowledge? And then the more the more you dig, especially when you're an investigator, because as an investigator, I don't take anybody at their word. I watch what people do, not what they say, and then I dig around for evidence. And one piece of evidence will normally lead to another and another and another. And I'm looking at the climate agenda in Canada right now, that you have to remember that our Minister of Environment and what do they call it, climate change now? I mean, he's a convicted felon. The guy's a convicted felon. They had to scrape him down off a water tower. He was convicted and he was also up on the roof out in Alberta, I think, of Ralph Klein's house with just his wife home, terrorizing her. The guy's
That guy, he looks like he has crazy eyes. Like that guy, I could believe if he was a child molester or a terrorist.
So here's what you have to ask yourself. Okay, so that guy, if you ever listen to Gilbo's his name, if you ever listen to what he has to say, he's a certified radical kook, straight up, right? And you got to remember that he's already broke the law numerous times to push his climate agenda, what he believed about climate change. That's why he was on that water tower. That's why he was arrested for mischief. That's why he was convicted. And how he ever made his way into politics is beyond me. But you got to remember that this guy has already proven he'll break whatever law he deems necessary to push his climate agenda. And now he has access to the resources of the military, multiple police forces, the RCMP, CSIS, anybody that he wants to do what he wants done. And if people think there's not black budgets in Canada, you need to wake up and have yourself a cup of real strong coffee here, because it's much like you see in all these different agencies. It's much like CSIS. Even CSIS, for example, CSIS can't lay charges. They'll go out and they dig up information and they hand it off to parliamentarians. But because of how they obtained the evidence, it can't be used in court. That's why those 11 people so far aren't in jail and being perp walked out of Parliament right now. There's a high probability how the evidence was gained wouldn't stand up in a court of law as being 100%. They might not have had a warrant when they have the information, they have the evidence, but the evidence is not admissible in court. And that happens all the time. And you got to remember, if you're in the military, you got a job to do. You just go do what you're told to do. Or if you have a radical group, Canada's full of radical groups. And radical groups come up from the U.S. that are funded by George Soros on a regular basis. So all of a sudden, we have less fires coast to coast Canada, but they're bigger. And then the other thing that most people aren't aware of is when the government back around when they started more than a dozen years ago talking about climate change, they systematically coast to coast Canada started reducing their firefighting capacity. In Nova Scotia, we got rid of our fire burning permit system that we had. We got rid of our fire towers, spotting towers. We got rid of our largest helicopter, our helitack crews. We got rid of, what else did we get rid of? There was another thing that we got rid of. Every one of those things were detrimental to forest firefighting. Out in Alberta, when I think it was the NDP were in, they made major cuts to their forest firefighting budget. So while everybody was screaming climate change, right, everybody was cutting forest fire budgets from coast to coast Canada. Now, I believe out in Alberta, they've seen the error of their ways. And I think with Danielle Smith, they're trying to change some things. But you guys out in BC, you guys are turning into I don't mean to be too hard on BC, but man, you guys are turning into a socialist cesspool out there. I run into people in Nova Scotia that left BC to get away. You can buy a house down here for half the price in BC too, and you don't have to deal with a lot of that stuff. And if people trust those election results out in BC, you need to start doing some research, because it doesn't take 8 days to figure out who won an election. It just doesn't work that way. So the agenda in Canada for the federal government and the guy who's in charge of the department, who was warned for 2 years in Jasper, you were looking at a catastrophic fire if these steps aren't taken, and they ignored them all. And like I said, 50 trained certified firefighters showed up in Jasper with 20 pieces of heavy equipment. Some of them were the big airport tankers that they use when planes crash. They had high-end equipment and highly trained people. And when they showed up at Jasper, the federal government wouldn't let them fight fire. They had to stand there and watch structures burn to the ground. I watched the guy give evidence here in Parliament 2 weeks ago talking about this. And so why do they let buildings burn? In Canada, here in Nova Scotia, we had $200 million worth of forests and homes burned down, and they wouldn't hire us. And so I have to say, okay, why are you on the news saying we need all help you can get, and you've got a team of experts willing to help you, and you're not willing to hire them? And at the same time, I need to be clear, we weren't going to volunteer. We wanted to go back in at regular wages. We were willing to go for 30 days, go anywhere they wanted. And we weren't going to gouge the province. And meanwhile, they said, no, we're going to bring in people from South Africa, Central U.S., and other areas. And none of them had fought fires in the Acadian Forest region in Nova Scotia, ever.
So is your suggestion that the reason they brought those people is because they knew that they didn't know how to deal with it effectively?
No, I don't think that's what it was. Is because what they were trying to do is saying, look at us, look at the great job we're doing. And the only reason that the fires get put out in Nova Scotia was a result of we got 3 weeks of heavy rain after that. And by the way, the province banned all woods travel during that 30-day period. And during that period, we had record-breaking rain for 3 weeks. And what most people weren't aware of, and it was pointed out to me by somebody who's better educated on the issue, he said, Peter, he said, Nova Scotia just went through the first climate lockdown in North America. You guys were the test province. And I said, what are you talking about? Well, he said, nobody could go in the woods for 3 weeks and it was raining. And you were told you can't go in the woods because the woods could burn down because you're walking in the woods. And nobody pushed back. And it was a test. And the test was, how much are people going to push back when you're told you can't travel for climate-related reasons? And we didn't push back at all. I mean, some people pushed back, and every court in Nova Scotia said nobody had standing. You don't have standing. I know you weren't allowed to walk in the woods, but you have no standing, and no one will prosecute it. And they got away with it. And I guarantee you that under this premier, they'll do it again. This same premier, he passed legislation in Nova Scotia to charge people standing on the side of the highway with a sign that said freedom, $25,000. While we were in 3 weeks of heavy rainfall last spring, when those fires were going on in Nova Scotia, he put a complete ban on burning so that if you had a fire pit in your backyard and a fire in it, it's going to be a $25,000 fine during the rain. Right? So it had nothing to do with fires. It had to do with control. How much can we push people without getting pushback? Are we going to be able to tell people they can't travel based on a climate agenda? And now that we have everybody afraid that, the world's coming to an end because of the climate agenda, well, then what are we going to be able to do? How do we prove that there's a climate agenda or that we have major climate concerns, massive forest fires? We have fewer fires than we used to have, but they're bigger now. And they're bigger because everybody cut their fire budget when they should have been, if they really believed there was we were going to have problems from forest fires, they should have been increasing their budget, not decreasing it. Even when I started in Nova Scotia, every district office had a 5-man fire crew. Now it's down to 3. There's less equipment, less money, less of everything. And the person who runs forest firefighting thing down here, he wasn't a DEI hire, but he was in that secret handshake club when he got the job. So sometimes, it's like, I don't know, does anybody in your office want to, fly from one side of Canada to the other when the pilot isn't the best pilot, but he got hired because he ticked the boxes? I mean, he might have been at the very bottom of the class. And he had some bumpy landings with some single engine aircraft, but we got to get our numbers up there. We don't got enough DEI hires. You want that guy flying the plane you're on? You want him being the brain surgeon, him or her being the brain surgeon that's working on you in a hospital? As a matter of fact, the hospital in Ontario now, or university, I think in Ontario this week, announced that 75% of the people that they're going to accept into their new doctors programs are going to be DEI. They're going to have to meet diversity, equity, and inclusion parameters in order to get into university to become a doctor. Is that who you want? I don't want them working on me. I can tell you that. So, and that started in the 90s with the RCMP. We had a Sikh gentleman who wanted to wear his turban and carry
I
a turban.
remember this. Yeah, yeah.
So he went to court and he won that case. And that opened it. I had a friend of mine who was, I mean, everything he did was about becoming a Mountie. And they put the brakes on and stopped hiring straight white guys. And they started hiring every minority, everything that you could possibly imagine to start boosting these numbers. And then that mindset went all across all federal government, and then it leaked into provincial government. So here's what happened. You cannot get promoted inside the bureaucracy in Canada, inside any government, federal or provincial, unless you're full on woke. And that includes all the police departments now. And so once that happened with RCMP, people you wouldn't never want to go on patrol with. You definitely wouldn't want to be in a gunfight with. But these were what we call carpet cops, shiny boots, right? The guys who never did anything, but they promoted, they promoted the painted crosswalks, and they promoted every group that felt that they had been somehow vilified over their lifetime, and they pushed that, and they pushed it. And those people went right up to the chain and all the upper echelons in the RCMP. And that's why the RCMP now is woke and broke. Because I used to patrol that area in Nova Scotia for 10 years as a game warden where the Portapique massacres were. And I'm going to tell your audience right now, and for every Mountie that's watching across Canada, I feel bad for you because some of you guys still want to do a good job. And you're burdened with woke tards running the force from one end of Nova Scotia to the other. And I can challenge any of you to argue with me on that, because that's what's happened. And so what happened down there, that was the largest cluster F in Canadian policing history. And people need to understand, because the RCMP are so woke, 3 people got promoted. Everybody who could retire, retired. And anybody who could get out of Dodge, get out of Dodge. And it was one of the largest communications disasters in policing I'd ever seen. And the person in charge of communications got some kind of an award and a promotion. And then the government spent $59 million trying to hide what happened. And if you really want to know what happened, I got a friend of mine named Paul Palango who wrote a book called 22 Murders. And it's the best researched, true story on a major crime that I've ever read. It's just spectacularly done. I hope he wins major awards for it. It's a bestseller. Go read 22 Murders and then decide if you still trust the RCMP to do anything for you across Canada. And I mean anything. I mean, don't get me wrong, the guys are pretty good at giving out speeding tickets or something. But, I opened three independent RCMP investigations with complaints I had with Ottawa RCMP. One was when Trudeau was involved in the Ogacon affair and violated Section 119121 of the Criminal Code. Should have went to jail for up to 12 years. I talked with a couple of retired police officers, a couple of lawyers, and I said, well, this is outrageous. The guy, he took a bribe from a lobbyist, a couple of $100,000, his trip was valued at. And he was being investigated by the ethics commissioner. So RCMP opened the file. And a couple of weeks later, Justin Trudeau did a DEI appointment. He hired Brenda Lucki to head the RCMP. And I've talked to RCMP people who knew Brenda Lucki and said, she did good to make it to sergeant, not commissioner. And so Trudeau wanted a woman in there. He wanted a DEI hire. Let's put her in. It's 2015 or whatever it was at the time, 2018, when she got the job. So while the RCMP had an ongoing investigation into Justin Trudeau corruption, accepting that bribe, he hired Brenda Lucki, and a couple of weeks later, they shut down that investigation. And then when the We Charity came along, I opened another investigation with Ottawa RCMP. They assigned a file number to it. I think that one was... matter of fact, I have it right here. Look at that. I keep it here as a reminder. That was 2020-10-19-302, Ottawa RCMP. And Brenda Lucki made sure the We Charity investigation got shut down as well. But Bill Morneau did resign. But Trudeau walked away scot-free. And then I also filed another complaint. And when Trudeau gave a hate speech rant on a Quebec TV station about, how Canadians who didn't get vaxxed were basically devils with horns and all kinds of things. He called them everything. And that was a hate speech ranch. And they opened an investigation on that. And that file number was 2022-13124. That was Section 319. And that one got squashed under Brenda Lucki as well. And so when Brenda Lucki got caught being involved, being a political water girl on the Portapique thing, she shortly after that, she got out of Dodge and took a big pension and walked. And the new guy they have in there, under no circumstance is he gonna follow up on an investigation on Justin Trudeau. The PMO, who's not supposed to tell the RCMP what to do, they do tell them what to do. And now they have all these woke police officers in the upper echelons who all they worry about is their own hide. And what's the latest thing that we can push? Can we get tampons in the men's bathroom? Same's over with the militaries. I mean, it's nonsense. So all it does is it just destroys morale, right? Like, when I was a kid, man, you went in the Mounties. I mean, these guys were all 6 foot tall, tough brawlers that had a job to do, and you respected them. And now, I'm just telling you, I carried a gun for the government for a long time, and there's people that you don't want to be ever in a bad situation, and I guarantee you don't want a DEI hire beside it. I mean, DEI hires should be labeled that. They should wear a badge that says DEI hire, so you can't expect much from them. Okay, you weren't the sharpest knife in the drawer, but you got the job because you ticked the boxes. And I know you're on the board, and I know now you're the senior director, and they're thinking about making you into the deputy minister, and we're going to be stuck with you. And they destroy everything they touch. That's the biggest problem that we have in healthcare here right now in Nova Scotia. You could clear out 70% of upper level management, and they wouldn't be missed. 50% of middle management, and they wouldn't be missed either. But you've got DEI hires and woke people who have no idea what they're doing. And everybody's trying to make decisions from inside the box. I talk to doctors and I talk to medical professionals about different things all the time. And they all tell me the exact same thing. He said, everything's top heavy, cannot get the situations fixed. Then they bring people in to head up the whole operation, and you start digging around and, oh, look, they're another DEI hire. And you wonder why things can't get fixed. So without meritocracy, you have nothing. Society collapses. If you start hiring, you're going to drive across like a big span bridge made by the guy who was at the very bottom of the engineering class. And, he's just borderline. Nobody else wants to hire him, but he's going to tick off the box that says, I'm questioning. I'm LGBTQ questioning +2, or you're part of the alphabet soup group. I don't care what people do with their private lives, but I'd like them to keep it private. I don't shove what I do down people's throats. And it would be nice if people didn't do that or hold up their hands and say, you have to treat me differently because of that. I do not want to drive across bridges that weren't made by a good engineer. I do not want to drive on roads not made by good engineers. I don't want to drive cars made by DEI mechanics, right? So I can look from coast to coast Canada. I look at what happens, this stuff with I look at this stuff with the climate agenda, and it's absolute garbage nonsense. People are completely neglecting the fact that we set some cold records here in Canada in the last few years. Now, don't get me wrong, out here on the East Coast where I am, our winters are a little shorter, but where I'm sitting right now used to be under 6 kilometers of an ice sheet, and all the coal deposits in Newfoundland or here in Nova Scotia are from what used to be a jungle. And I can guarantee you the ice caps didn't melt like caveman having campfires, right? So what we have is it's like common sense has fled the room. It's hard to find people that are capable of just critical thought. You're not taught in school. And somebody asked me this one time, and I'm going to go back to a question you asked earlier. Why don't people fight back? And why don't people push back? And I can tell you when that started too. That started in the late 80s in the school system in Canada. And when it started was, when I grew up in a small town school, if a bully picked on you, you were allowed to fight back. And the teacher went over and said, who started this fight? And it was the bully. So the bully got sent home or down for a strap. And the guy who didn't start it, you just went back into class. Well, in the late 80s, that all changed. And it was strategically done. And it was done strategically and intentionally put on the population of both the United States and here in Canada. So what happened was, if 2 kids got in a fight in school, what they said is violence solves nothing. Well, that always comes from people, who didn't have family in World War II, right? When people say violence solves nothing, well, I don't have to speak German today because of people who believed in violence that was directed at evil. So when you got in a fight in school starting in the late 80s, everybody got punished. So let's say someone came and pushed you down and you fought back. Both of you got suspended. And all they said is, no violence, we can't have any violence, violence solves nothing. So we raised, since the late 80s to today, generations of kids that were taught, do not fight back, even if it's wrong, even if you're being bullied. Even if you're being bullied, you have to go ask someone to help you. You're not allowed to stand up for yourself. And it's dead wrong. I talk about it in my book. Like, I talk about a lot of things. Like, I get tired of all this stuff and trying to explain what we're doing with independent Nova Scotia. So I wrote a book called The Redneck Conservative. And I'm assuming that, well, I'm just assuming that if Bill C-63 gets passed, that book's going to get banned, and they're probably going to come back and try to put me in jail, right? And actually, that book was number one. It was actually number one in 3 categories on Amazon, and you can get it in ebook and audio. And I grew up in a little town, and I'm no Ernest Hemingway. I'm not even a good writer, but I think the book's got 4.9 star rating or 5-star rating, and everybody that reads it says they really like it. And it's very timely what's happened in Canada. And I don't pull any punches. If you're a criminal politician, I call you out. If you're incompetent, I call you out. But the nice thing about it is we offer a solution with the independents that anybody can pick it up and go to the back of the book in that final chapter, and it says, here's how you solve a lot of the political problems in Canada, because the party system's broke. As a matter of fact, our motto is the party's over. Every time we send stuff out, that's how we end it. The party's over. And party politics is broken.
Peter, I could go all night, but I'm trying to be mindful of your time. I know you have things to do. You also wanted to talk about some event coming up with you and Jim Ferguson?
Yeah, actually, somebody introduced me to Jim Ferguson because of that video I did. By the way, that video I told you that I did a video on what happened with the fire here in Nova Scotia, and I blew the whistle on the premier and the provincial Department of Natural Resources and the provincial government, and that got 177 million views worldwide. So I had people calling me, man, from Europe. Reiner Fulmick called me. I had people calling me from Australia, New Zealand, South America, Europe, going, what the hell's going on with fires in Canada? I mean, I'm just one guy down on the East Coast who grew up in a small town. So that kind of inspired me. I've been working on the book for a while. And so, when I finally got it done, I just laid out, here's a whole bunch of things that are happening and why they're happening. And rather than be the guy who just complains, I'm the guy who wanted to offer a solution to people. Anyways, I got sidetracked. Go back to that question again. Sorry.
Jim Ferguson?
Oh, yeah. So Jim Ferguson was one of the people that said you should contact, or Jim Ferguson got a hold of me after that. And so Jim started up, right now it's the fastest growing freedom movement, I think, in the world. It's called Freedom Train International. And we were going to do a 24-hour around the clock freedom talk where we had different guests from all over the world. And that was going to take place on November 1st. But we just had a meeting this evening. We're going to delay it till right now. It's going to be delayed to January 1st. And it's going to start at midnight in New Zealand. I think it's either New Zealand or Australia where the year starts. And then we're going to have speakers from all around the world for a 24-hour period. And we're going to have, Canada will be represented. I've got some people that have already invited, and we'll have more. And I'm going to have slots, I think, here in Canada for I'll be hosting a 4-hour talkathon, I guess it'll be. And we're going to try to fit in 12 different people. And these are heavy hitters. These are some of the top freedom fighters from across the world, people that everybody will recognize their names, right? And so what we hope to do with that is we're going to have those people advertise on their own that they're going to be on it so that people can start the world off right with some hope. It's kind of like, this is going to lose half your listeners here right here off the bat. But, I can tell you right now, if Donald Trump doesn't win in the U.S. election down there, freedom's toast in the U.S. It's gone. And I can tell you what the federal government's trying to do here in Canada with Bill C-63. Your show, they'll work to shut you down. Independent media will be gone. My book will be gone. And the conversation we just had will be outlawed in Canada under Bill C-63. It's the most dangerous piece of legislation anybody's tried to bring in, and Trudeau's trying to get it passed before the next election so he can shut down independent media, because he looks at them categorically as the enemy, and they are, because the enemy of all tyrants is the truth. And the man, I mean, there's another DEI hire. You got to look at our prime minister. What was he qualified to do? He's a snowboarder and not a very good canoeer. I think he did some, and then he did some skiing. And then, he got kicked out of Grey Academy. I think he was 27 years old, and there was allegations, and I wasn't there, and I can't prove it, but there were multiple allegations made that he was having a relationship with an underage girl and paid out $2.25 million in hush money prior to the last election. And see, another thing about votes and the corruption inside the system, I bet you there's not 1 in 10 people watching this show right now that know in the last federal election, 205,000 mail-in ballots didn't get counted.
Spoiled ballots?
No, not spoiled, just didn't get counted. They weren't there on time for one reason or another. But 205,000 ballots didn't get counted in the last election. That was enough to potentially change that. That's the whole voting population of Halifax, a big city like Halifax here on the East Coast. Votes didn't count. Nobody knew. Mainstream media didn't talk about it. Anybody can just punch in 205,000 ballots not counted last federal election. It'll pop up and you'll go, why didn't you hear about it? Because mainstream media is fully corrupt. One of the most brilliant things the Trudeau government did was when he first ran for office, he told CBC, we'll give you another $670 million in your budget, provided we win the election. And they became rabid haters of the federal Conservative Party, and they threw all their might behind it. And so you're looking at Pierre Poilievre now, right? CBC, literally, they're bought off they're propaganda arm for the federal liberal government. And they know that if Trudeau loses the next election, the newsroom of CBC is getting shut down. Pierre Poilievre 100% will dismantle that. He'll leave a bunch of the other stuff. But anybody that's been used to getting a free ride from the government, when the Conservative government comes in, we got a federal government right now. We're paying $1 billion. That's $1,000 million every week in interest payments on the national debt. 1,000 million. See, people forget how much $1 billion is, and that's the kind of money. I mean, I'm looking at the amount of money that Climate Barbie there, the wingnut, that was the other one who was running the environmental portfolio before the guy who's in there now.
Greta Thunberg?
No, not Greta Thunberg. She was, I forget what her name was, but she was the federal minister of environment and climate change. My understanding under programs she was involved with, there's $60 billion unaccounted for that they don't know where it's at. So that's $60,000 million. I mean, and it's like this green slush fund where the federal government just gave out, $400 million, went back to the people, 186 people now it's been pointed out by the federal government that they gave money back to their own companies. And the corruption, nobody goes to jail. And nobody goes to jail because nobody's accountable. And because nobody's accountable, nobody wants to go and vote anymore because they don't think their vote matters. And I'm here to tell you, if you vote an independent your vote can matter for the first time in the last 20 years. And if you vote for any of the existing parties on a provincial basis, you get what you deserve. But for me, it's not what I deserve. I deserve a lot better for my wife and my kids and my grandkids. And if you care about your loved ones, you deserve a lot better too, right? People deserve better. And they settle for it, and they go, well, I had a friend at the house the other day. We were sitting in the backyard having a beer, and he said, I know you're into politics. I don't want to talk about it. I'm not interested in politics. Well, politics is interested in you, and they control every facet of your life. And for people to say, well, I'm not interested, well, man, why don't you just go dig a hole in the backyard and bend over and put your head in it? Pretend you're an ostrich, right? That's the dumbest thing a human being can say to me. Oh, I'm not interested in politics. They depend on people like you to stay in power. You get interested and you start doing some research and you get any common sense at all, you're going to go, good God, man, what happened to our country in the last 20 years? And it goes back to, I could point it all right back to DEI, but DEI was orchestrated. That didn't happen by accident, right? The stuff's been planned a long time. Anyways, I could go on for days doing this stuff, right?
Mr. MacIsaac, this was a fabulous episode, and it was a massive information transfer. People can follow you on your, is that your X handle, Peter R.
Yeah.
MacIsaac?
Well, and here's the thing about it. When I first started speaking up, I got up around 5,500 followers and they kicked me off. And I was gone for a year and I came back on. And I went back to 5,500 in the space of a month or two. But people have to understand that the AI bots at X still do their job. And if you're really outspoken, they've had me capped for a year. I can't pass over 5,500. So I've made a couple of complaints through to Elon, but I'm not a really big player. And so even same thing. My book's being throttled. Basically, everything I say is being throttled because the message that I'm telling people, I've got no reason to lie about nothing, right? Like I say, I'm just some guy, man, with a story to tell. I got no reason to lie to anybody. I'm telling you the way it really is. It's up to you to do your own research. I hope you don't believe a single thing I tell you. I hope you go and do all your own research, because once you start researching, it's like, if you're at a bad car accident, you see something really horrendous, you're going to see it for the right. You can never unsee it. And once you start doing research and realize you're being lied to every day by your own government, you can't unsee that stuff. And then when you find out, you're asking, well, why is this level of crime happening? The police are doing nothing. Because you can't get promoted doing your job. You can only get promoted by pushing woke agendas inside our local police forces now. There's a lot of frustrated, good police officers from coast to coast Canada who want to do a good job. And I just wish to God one of them had enough backbone to just not go to the supervisor and start an investigation and then lay criminal charges against some of these politicians who need to spend a long time in jail. What needs to happen is politicians need to be perp walked out of Parliament in handcuffs and taken downtown and processed. And then they need to start going to jail for long periods of time for the amount of corruption and theft and stuff that they put us through, right? And I watched an awful lot of it with COVID. My wife worked in cancer clinical trials for half her working career. She knew instantly she said to me, where are the informed consent in the field that she worked in. Informed consents were often over 20 pages, and they all had to be initialed by a doctor and the patient or the person involved. And if they weren't all initialed, they could shut down. The people lost their jobs. People, they would temporarily shut down whole studies. And when COVID came out, like, I'm an investigator myself, and I went, okay, well, none of this is making sense. And because I knew the government lied on a continual basis, the more research I did, the more I went, okay, they're lying about this, they're lying about informed consent, and my wife is going, you can't do this stuff without proper informed consent, especially when there's known not cures, but there's known treatments like ivermectin. I don't want to get your show knocked off, but ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine. Now they're proven not only the CDC actually had to come out and say, yeah, we were wrong. Ivermectin would have worked. And by the way, it cures a whole bunch of different cancers. It doesn't treat them. It actually makes them go away. And we didn't want people knowing that. And so, like I say, I just look at, all I ever look at is evidence. I couldn't care less what people think. What's the evidence say? And the evidence say you're lied to every day. There's an agenda to push forest fires across Canada so that they can justify crushing the economy with a carbon tax. And, if you do any research at all, and you'd be really wise to do a ton of research before you ever let anybody else in Canada stick anything else back into your arm. You got to remember, a lot of the doctors that are there now are DEI hires as well. Anyway, I don't want to destroy people's entire belief in the system, because there's a ton of good people trying to do things. And the number one way we figured out how to do it is elect enough independents. Because other than that, I've heard people talking about force and the rest of it, and that's not going to work. You have to use the government's own rules against them, and the rules of Parliament allow enough independents to take control of the legislature. And if they're tied down by performance contracts, we can take this country back. I mean, I grew up loving this country. Proudest thing I ever did was spend the first 5 days at the truckers thing up in Ottawa, talking to police officers on the ground who said this is the most peaceful, protest they'd seen in their entire working history. And every day the news was online. And every day I went around talking to police officers on the ground who said, man, these people, this is what you're hearing on the news. That's absolute garbage. I mean, the first weekend, not a single arrest, 30,000 people on the ground. Press saying there was like less than 10,000. I said, how do you know there's 30,000? Because he said, we know how many square meters is here and we know all this stuff. And when she's packed up, buddy, we know the numbers. So we were being lied to about everything with the trucker stuff. It was scandalous. And nobody was held accountable. Right? So anyways, you know what, guys? I'm going to close this out, but what people in Canada need to understand, there's nobody coming to save you. There is nobody riding up on a white horse who one day is going to fix all this. People say, well, in this election, this guy will fix it. Ain't nobody going to fix it. You know who's going to fix it? The people that are sitting in a chair at home that just say, look, there used to be a movie, but he said, I'm sick and tired of this and I'm not going to take it anymore. And they're going to be the ones that overcome the training that they got in school for the last 40 years where they were taught, do not fight back. You're not allowed to fight back against bullies or you're going to be punished. Well, they need to realize what happened to them and went, you know what he said, that's actually true. Because my kid got in a fight and they both got kicked out of school and it wasn't his fault, right? So we were all trained not to fight back, but I didn't listen to that nonsense. I fought back anyway. And I got kicked out and I didn't care. My mom taught me to question everything, and so I did. You go read that book in there. There's a ton of wild stories in there, and I couldn't tell half of them to tell you the truth, right? But I'm sure there's enough in there to get the book banned if C-63 comes through. Anyways, look, Payman, I appreciate. Oh my God, we were only supposed to do an hour, buddy. I'm just looking at that time up there.
I'm sorry for taking up your time. Yeah.
Well, no, you're not, because you know what? The message needs to get out there, and that's why I wrote that book, because if it gets banned and I get banned, there's no other way to get that. For me to get my message out anymore. And I would really appreciate anybody watching this. Follow me on Facebook, because I'm not on Facebook, but on X. And you can go over to Independent NS on Facebook. We have a group, and you'll follow, because I'm going to be exposing corruption inside the provincial government for the next 30 days. It's not going to end. And I plan on having myself a good time. I guarantee it. But the premier won't be happy.
Anyway, Mr. MacIsaac, I wish you the best of luck in the coming election.
Yeah, and people actually, they can go over to independentns.ca and learn a little bit more what they're doing. And what we're doing can be done in every province. And we're trying to create a blueprint for the rest of the country. So anyway, thanks for listening, folks. And Payman, I appreciate it very much.
Sorry, is that accurate? Is it independentns.ca or .net?
It was .net originally, but it's oh, look, I've got it up there. It's actually .ca. We just changed it.
Okay.
Okay, I never noticed that till now, but we went to independentns.ca. And the reason we had to do that, because we had to back up our servers. We had a board meeting one night, and within 3 hours, all our computers were wiped out.
CSIS will do that.
CSIS will do that. Especially when they're taking orders from either from the RCMP or the PMO's office. Anyways, that said, guys, question everything. And if you're going to fight for anything in this lifetime, I want to point this out. If we don't put a combination of Trump, Polyev in, we're going to lose this country and we're going to lose the U.S. The amount of crushing tyranny that's in place right now, that's trying to be pushed on us, we will not recover from. So people need to know that. And so when you look in the mirror tomorrow, you're the guy or gal on the white horse. You stand up and do something. Stop waiting for someone else to do it. Seriously. One day your grandkids are going to say, Grampy or Dad or Mom or Dad or Grammy, what did you guys do while our freedom was stole from us here in Canada? And you're going to have to sit there and say, well, you know what? Grampy was busy fishing and wearing the hair off the back of his head, drinking beer, watching Netflix, right? Or you can get up and do something, because we're all going to be dead one day. You may as well do something you can be proud of. Anyways, thanks again. Appreciate it.
All right. Take care, Peter.
You got it,
Bye,
buddy.
everyone.